So it seems we live in a time where having a central and moderate position is no longer a thing.
My family lineage is settlers from the 1500s.
Colonialists.
Yeah, colonials.
You don't look very Native American to me.
I am Native American. Whites are Native Americans. What are you talking about?
You're not.
What are you talking about?
You're a little bit more than a far-right Republican.
Hey, what can I say?
I think you can say I'm a fascist.
Yeah, I am.
Listen to me. I am an immigrant. I'm speaking from personal experience.
Get the hell out.
I don't even like... I should get the hell out.
Yes.
Why?
I don't want you here.
Shut up, Destiny. Shut up.
You're so shameless, dude.
You can't even condemn the cold-blooded
Because
execution
I can't.
of Charlie
Donald Trump
Kirk.
turns on Destiny.
I don't think you're in the
on YouTube,
position
and he
to
says, "I
demand
wonder what
anything from
Destiny's saying
anybody.
on YouTube. That's how I'm going to take my.
You're
my
not in
point.
any position.
I hate my opponent, and I don't want the best for them. I'm sorry. I am sorry, Erica. But now Erica can talk to me and the whole group, and maybe they can convince me that that's not right, but I can't stand my opponent.
Well, not online anyway. And this makes sense. Having a central and moderate position is boring, I suppose, whilst extremism does the numbers. And with the feeling of declining living standards in general and the general sense of dissatisfaction, things are either going to go left or they're going to go right. And with all this in mind, the UK Chancellor's budget announcement in about a month's time at the time of recording could be the thing that swings this one way or the other. And I think with that in mind, we can have a bit of fun about what we think is going to be announced and what do we think is going to be included. And there has been a lot of announcements around this already. There's been a lot of papers and articles trying to predict what's going on, as well as content on online as well. But the reality is nobody really actually knows what's going to happen here, and I think for me, that's why I say it's just a bit of fun to have a think about. Obviously, we can speculate and just have a think about what we're going to do in response to that. So with that in mind, let's get into this. So one of the areas I've been hearing about, and again, it's been online in the rumour mills for quite some time now, is potential changes to the ISA allowance. So the ISA allowance is about £20,000 in the UK, and this is a tax-free amount you can put in savings in the form of cash, or you can use to invest in eligible stocks or shares. Now, this is a very popular scheme. It's one that's well understood, and any changes that may restrict it in any way, certainly the cash element, I don't think would be politically popular. And at the moment, the Labour government is becoming more unpopular. There is a feeling that there's a lot of challenge from their political opponents on the right. And I don't think Labour would want to do anything that would make them even more unpopular, or could be viewed as an indirect tax on those that are working. And I think it would do both those things. And I think Labour understand it will do those two things. And I would expect them not to make any changes to this allowance. Now, the reason why it's viewed as an indirect tax on individuals is because it brings more savings into the scope of income tax, and in specifically interest tax or interest income tax. And this will be compounded for those who are higher earners, because they lose their personal allowance after about 100 grand for salaried income, which is about £12,570, I believe. But there's also a small tax-free allowance for your interest earnings, which you also lose. So you lose both of those tax-free allowances. So the ISA scheme and the cash ISA scheme was one way of mitigating that. But actually, if you remove that, or you lower the cash element of that, then obviously you're going to be taxing people in effect a lot more than they would have been otherwise. And also politically, it would go against, or it would be perceived as going against one of the sort of pledges the UK government, the Labour government made, was that they would be on the side of working people, which means they would be, not raising taxes, but although they said specific taxes, but generally speaking, they're not going to be raising taxes on those that work. So I think this would be a deeply unpopular announcement if it was something that the Chancellor chose to do. And therefore, I don't expect that announcement to be made or any changes to be made to the ISA scheme. But obviously, we'll just have to wait and see what the Chancellor in her wisdom decides to do, and whether or not, the pressures of the growing deficit just forces her hand and means she has to do this, whether it's a popular thing to do or not, I suppose.
We've been really clear in our manifesto about the taxes that we won't increase. And we're not going to increase the taxes that working people pay, their income tax, their national insurance and their VAT, because I do recognise the struggle that ordinary working people have faced these last few years with the cost of living. And so those manifesto commitments around income tax, national insurance and VAT, they absolutely stand.
Now, another thing I've been hearing about, which has been creating a lot of buzz, again online specifically, is around a proposed introduction of a national insurance contribution tax on private rental income. Now, national insurance contributions would be akin to, say, Social Security, if you are based in the US, for example. And basically, the sort of justification for this is that basically rental income from second, third or small portfolios of homes by private landlords is not earned income, it's passive income. Now, that's an interesting way of positioning this, because the wealthy, the very wealthy, earn passively if you view a landlord as earning passively. Now, if you speak to many landlords, I don't think they would view themselves as having passive income. I think they would view themselves as working like everybody else to maintain those properties, etc., etc. So it is potentially quite a triggering term to use, I would suggest. But I think for me, putting the philosophical positioning and then the rhetoric and the semantics about this to one side, I think this is something that potentially could happen. And the reason why I think it could happen is because it could be positioned as a form of wealth tax, arguably, in my view, on the wrong demographic. Wealth taxes and asset taxes should be on the ultra wealthy. So these are billionaires and people with, a net worth of, say, 100 million, 200 million. Those are the kind of individuals I think a wealth tax should be focused on, rather than rich landlords. That's my own personal view. And ultimately, this is a tax that they would be paying. So if you look at the statistics and the records around this, it would show them as the liable parties, which they are, if it's introduced, and they'll be the ones paying it. Now, the reality is the housing market in the UK, and it's the same everywhere, and it's the same with the rental market, actually, in terms of rental stock, as we call it. There's a lot more demand than there is supply. And therefore, many people that are tenants don't really have a choice. And even if they choose to rent somewhere else, they're not necessarily going to find it very easy to find a cheaper rental deal. So the leverage is on the landlord side, in my view. And with that being the case, what I think will happen is that they will simply pass on that cost of the additional tax, as they've done so with increased interest rates, for example, onto the tenant. So it actually becomes an indirect tax on the cost of living for the tenant. And if you are a landlord, and you are subject to this tax, and it's a straight line tax, and what I mean by that is that it's a flat tax rate on all the rental income, then there's a very simple grossing up formula you can apply to work out the additional amount of rent you need to charge to your tenants. So I think from my perspective, my hope is that this isn't introduced, because I think on many levels, economically and philosophically, it's not something I'm in alignment with. But if it is introduced, then I think it's going to disproportionately impact those that are struggling the most, i.e. those that are not in the position to buy their own home, who are relying on, a tenancy, And as many people in that situation know, it's very, very difficult to feel secure around your tenancy when you are subject to increases based on the fact that the landlord more often than not is in a position where they can increase prices and quickly find a new tenant, and you're in a situation where you can't then find a home. So again, it'll be interesting to see if this rumor is realized, becomes true. I think it could, but as I say, my hope is that it does not. Now, thinking about working and tax on work, so this is income tax. It's not been lost on many, especially many of Labour's opponents, political opponents and otherwise, that the tax rates have not changed in almost a decade at the time of recording. So as I mentioned, you have a tax-free allowance of about 12,570. I think about at 38,000 is the next banding, where it's about 20%. Then you get to about 50,000. I can't remember the exact bandings, but just take them as illustrative for the purpose of this discussion, where it'd be about 40%. And then you get to about 127,000, I believe, or something like this, before you're at the additional higher rate. But what happens, as I mentioned, is that after 100,000 or so, you start losing your personal allowance, and that diminishes every £2 you earn over £100,000. So what has been talked about in this regard is the idea or the concept of fiscal drag. So what you would expect over time is that your salary increases with inflation, and that's a reasonable assumption. That's typically historically what happens. And this is on a macro level, right? So it's not, in your own individual situation, your salary may not get adjusted for inflation, but on a macro level, on aggregate, salaries increase by inflation. And then what that means is that because those bandings never change, more and more people are being subject to increasing tax amounts. And then what is also happening is that the cost of living is increasing with inflation as well. So basically what this means is that you're in a situation where, let's say, for example, you're earning £80,000 now, and in the future, you're earning £100,000. So in theory, in the future, you're richer. But what you're finding is that the cost of living is a lot higher in the future than it was now. So that £100,000 actually has the buying power of £70,000 today. And I know that's a strange concept to imagine, but that's essentially what inflation and cost of living does. If the cost of living goes up a lot higher than your earnings, then you're basically poorer. And then if the amount of tax you're paying also increases as you're getting poorer, it compounds the fact that you're poorer. And that's essentially what is going on. And that's part of the reason why you're seeing this diminishing general living standards, and why everything just feels more expensive, and why house prices are running away from salaries. They're running away from them in terms of house price inflation is higher and more accelerated than wage inflation, but also more of your wages by virtue of fiscal drag are being subject to more and more tax. So you're poorer and you're paying more tax if you are a worker. So this is why there has been a growing, buy-in to the idea of rethinking how taxes are applied. And that's why the discussions around an asset tax is gaining momentum, and I would agree with that. But I would also hope, and this is not a prediction, that there would be a change to these bandings, these tax bandings, to reflect inflation. I don't think it's going to happen. And, I don't think the government can even afford to make it happen. But I think it's something that they have to address in some way, and they have to think about this, because it is not sustainable to increase taxes. And they actually do need to do this. I think national debt, national borrowings now is about 3 trillion at the time this video was being made, and growing. So they've got to find a way of raising more taxes. But what they can't continue to do is keep looking at the PAYE system, just based on these different variables that are conspiring against working individuals. So, as I say, I don't think there'll be any changes around these bandings. And I think in a way that's almost good news, because I think in an ideal world, from the Chancellor's perspective, they would want to increase taxes on income. In many ways, I feel like they have to. And from our perspective, we would want to see those tax bandings lifted to offset this concept of fiscal drag that I've described. So the only safe halfway house is that there's effectively no change. So as I say, I don't expect there to be changes around this. I don't even think it was necessarily up for discussion in many ways. But I think it is important to raise this point because, as I say, the Chancellor is in a situation where they need to get a handle on the deficit, and they need to get a handle on the overall borrowing that is happening on a national level, and look to bring this down. Because, as I say, the current projections just mean the level of borrowing is just going up and up and up. And as I say, it's not, in my view, economically sustainable. Okay, so with that context and in the backdrop of increasing debt, increasing national debt, I should say, and the fact that the government is running in a deficit, so as I say, it doesn't have as much money to do the things it needs to be doing, i.e. Maintain the roads, maintain infrastructure, invest in public services. I think there's going to be restrictions on public spending, on departmental spending. There may be cuts in certain departmental areas. At the very minimum, there will be a slower increase in public spending, and that's typically what governments do. So if they plan to spend 50 million next year, then basically they would cut it to a 25 million increase. So there's still an increase, it's just a smaller increase, or there could be an absolute freeze. And I think we're going to see something like this in this announcement. As I say, I think there's a huge overwhelming pressure on any government, I think, but certainly the Labour government, to basically address the the deficit, and to address and bring down the amount of debt that the country is in, that the UK is in. And this is something the Chancellor has, talked about, and it's something, she's sort of put her reputation on, that she's going to basically balance the books, get the books in order after the mess, the Conservatives left. And I think if you're not going to raise taxes, then what else can you do other than make cuts? And again, this will be positioned as efficiencies, as innovation. But the reality is it's austerity or austerity light. And that's really what this is going to be. So one of the things you may have heard at the time this video came out was that there was going to be changes to migrant rules. So this was the rules around indefinite leave of stay, where migrants can come in, they work for 5 years, and then they can basically potentially be eligible for indefinite leave of stay, or even potentially citizenship, and then they'd be then eligible for benefits and full workers' rights, as you would expect from any other British citizen. Now, what they've done, and this is something the Home Secretary announced, was that they are looking to, or may have done already, extended that wait period from 5 years to 10 years. Now, politically, this will probably be a very popular change, because there is a sentiment that economic migrants are coming to places like the UK simply to take advantage of what is viewed as very liberal and generous benefits. Now, that's one way of looking at this. And I think if you are looking at this from a sentiment-driven political perspective, then it's an absolutely fine policy, I would argue. But economically, I don't think it will have any major or significant impact on the level of public spending, because what you find with migrants that are not able to fully integrate, whether that's economically or otherwise, is that it takes them longer to contribute to society, which is obviously what you want migrants to do. You want them to pay taxes, you want them to integrate, and if they're not able to work because there's restrictions about their work status, because there's there's this ambiguity about whether or not they're going to stay in the country, then it just makes it harder for them to then contribute to society in that way, start paying their fair share of taxes, and ultimately they're probably going to be needing some kind of support anyway, unless you deport them or unless they leave. And I think for me, that's something that has to be considered. And the other sort of elephant in the room in this scenario actually is that, in a scenario where people feel that they can't contribute, it can lead to marginalization. So it almost has the opposite impact of what you're actually hoping for. And it can create a scenario where people are susceptible to radicalization, for example. So I think for me, economically, it doesn't make a lot of sense. As I said, I don't think there's going to be a lot of gain out of it. But I think in terms of sending the right political signals, it may be viewed as a win, potentially, in terms of how it goes down with the general electorate. But what I will say, to be fair to the UK government, is that they will know this. They will understand that this is not something that economically is going to move the needle very significantly into a positive space. And that is why it was announced by the Home Secretary rather than the UK Chancellor. So basically what I'm saying in a roundabout way here is that the idea of restricting benefits and spending that's aimed towards migrants and non-UK citizens is not necessarily going to have the biggest impact economically. Unfortunately, any types of cuts that we see in this space are probably going to impact those that are struggling the most, who are UK citizens. And there's no getting around this if there's no willingness or appetite to consider taxing those who at the moment, based on their level of net wealth, do not pay as much as those who are, a lot poorer than them. I.e., if you're not considering any kind of asset tax or wealth tax, then the only thing you can really do is restrict public spending, i.e. start moving towards a smaller state, and increase the burden on working people. That is really the only way I think you can address this, if, as I say, you're not prepared to do anything else. And I think this has been the major criticism I would have of Labour and past governments, whether it's Conservatives or the Libs or whoever, where this sort of very moderate, sensible tinkering of economic and tax policy is supposed to, over time, somehow work. And history has shown us, it's not really working. And more of the same is the definition of, and expecting different results, apparently is the definition of madness. So, again, I just feel as though we're in a situation where the UK government doesn't really have a choice. And as I say, I will expect there to be, unfortunately, cuts to spending, cuts to welfare that will disproportionately impact UK citizens who are struggling already. Now, in amidst all this doom and gloom, I think the Chancellor will use this opportunity to be quite bullish. So often what you'll find with UK Chancellors is that they always use these opportunities to congratulate themselves on how well they've done, even if it's by saying they're not as bad as their predecessors, right? So, and I think there'll be more of the same in this budget. So obviously interest rates have come down, and the UK Chancellor will allude to the fact that she has something to do with it. Even though these are not things that are actually set by government, they're set independently by the Central Bank of England in this case. And also she'll want to show that the UK is a place where we should be doing business. And again, this is something she's talked about already in her Mansion House speech. I think I covered in a previous video. And I think we'll see some things that will signal to this sentiment. So one of the things I've been hearing around about is basically a reduction in business rates for smaller businesses. I don't know if that's necessarily going to be announced. Again, it's just a rumor, but it would make sense that something like that is announced, where the idea being that it's encouraging businesses to get set up, have office or physical premises or presence, and therefore stimulate more job opportunities. And if that is the case, that could be a good thing. There may be some more announcements around banking reforms. And again, she might provide a bit more detail around some of the things she mentioned in that Mansion House speech around obviously creating new products, so a new ISA product that could be used or taken advantage of by UK citizens. Again, she could obviously expand on what she talked about in terms of the sort of initiative she's looking to introduce to make home ownership a more of a realistic possibility for those who are currently being priced out, and just more around possible investments into UK businesses, again, just to stimulate growth. And I think, these are all well and good, but I think the reality is I am not convinced that this is, when you look about and I keep talking about this, when you look at the deficit the government is running under and the level of borrowing, simply investing and almost investing your way out of this problem, I'm not sure that on its own solves the problem. So I think for me, in summary, I think this will be a balanced announcement in the sense that there will be caution to justify what will be things that impact those that are struggling the most. So there will be things that, as I say, that will be announced that will basically be justifying cuts to welfare, no fundamental changes or improvements to income tax bands, because again, the Chancellor will say, look, we need to be cautious. The things I've done are working, and therefore I need to do more of the same. And as I say, I do not expect there to be any appetite to increase taxes or introduce a tax that disproportionately impacts high net worth individuals. And then what I mean by high net worth individuals are individuals who have, a huge amount of assets and can live off those assets without working. They don't rely on salaried work in order to maintain their lifestyles. So I think that's going to be one side of it, and then that's going to be juxtaposed with a more bullish position around the economy in general, the fact that the economy is improving, the fact that interest rates have come down, and therefore there'll be announcements around that to basically encourage further growth, or expected to produce further growth. And I think for me, that's fine, right? This is all going to be well and good. But the reality is, and this is my own personal view, and it's something that's been talked about by many people, when you have a situation where you have a growing economy, who benefits from that growing economy disproportionately, right? So the idea is that, the economy is growing, we're all making more, there's more jobs, the country's richer, but where does the line share of that wealth go? Because if the line share goes to a handful of individuals who have all the assets relative to everybody else, then you're still in a situation that regardless of whether times are good or bad, wealth inequality continues to increase. And if it continues to increase, you end up in a situation where the very, very poor in society can no longer access essential assets like homes, like education, a good quality education, I should say, good quality healthcare. And they also do not get representation from UK politicians who basically are more and more subject to the influence of the increasingly wealthy asset class. And I think for me, that's something that none of these announcements that UK chancellors have ever made ever get under the skin of and ever fully address. So really what I'm saying is whatever this UK budget announcement looks like, it's broadly going to look the same as many other announcements we've seen in the past. They might be different, slightly different flavors, slightly different spin. But I expect we're not going to be that surprised in the end. Until next time, take care. Peace.
As well, and we were in our manifesto, that the fiscal rules are non-negotiable. They are what give working people security around interest rates, for example, and interest rates have come down 4 times in the last year under this Labour government because of the stability that we've managed to return to the economy, which is underpinned by those fiscal rules which have enabled the Bank of England to cut interest rates. No chancellor is ever going to write a budget months before the budget is delivered, before a date even has been set for the budget. And I'm not going to provide a running commentary on the budget, but I do want to be clear that the manifesto commitments we made about not increasing those key taxes that working people pay, their income tax, their national insurance and VAT, those commitments stand because I do recognise, and this Labour government recognises, that it is working people who paid the price under the previous Conservative government for the economic mismanagement, and I don't want working people to be hit again.